The ayes are 61, the noes are 60. Part 1 as amended will stand part. We move to Part 2 and the question is that Part 2 stand part.
Speaker.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to speak to Part 2 of the bill, although I think perhaps a lengthier debate on Part 1 may have been in order, but I'm sure given there are some subsequent amendments within Part 2, we can cross-reference some of the implications of Part 2 against Part 1. But before we do, Mr. Speaker, I am frustrated by the misinformation that continues to be pursued by government members, and not least the Minister herself, who has continually tried to portray the Labour Party as being against people accessing benefit, and never a more ridiculous statement have I heard. As I've said before, Labour was the architect of our Social Security Act in New Zealand. We will defend to the death people's right of access to Social Security. But what we have been frustrated by is this minister's continual attempt to portray her welfare reforms as successful based on one criteria. And what is that criteria? A decrease in the number of people accessing benefits. All we have done on this side of the House is simply pointed out the fact that that's not in fact true. That if you use the MSD statistical assessment released annually, which uses June data and has been going right back to the 1940s, you'll find that based on that annualised data, we've seen some of the highest numbers under this minister than we've ever seen before, based on that MSD statistical assessment on annualised figures from June. So what Melissa Lee said before about high numbers of sickness beneficiaries under Labour, actually not true when you look at the record of this minister. So yes, we will point that out, because on that minister's criteria, she has failed. But on the criteria of morality, on the criteria of a dignified system, on the criteria of doing right by job seekers who are actively seeking employment, this bill also fails. This bill fails on those sets of criteria which we set ourselves as members of the Labour Party. On those counts, this bill fails, and I think it's only fair that we continue to raise those issues in this House. Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to section 65 of Part 2 of this bill, which hasn't been touched on, section 60 GAE amended, which refers to beneficiaries having an additional dependent child whilst on the benefit. Now, the minister raised last week that this is the very reason for the existence of these changes in these welfare reforms. The minister's belief that there are too many people having babies on the domestic purposes benefit, that is her sole driving force in presenting this bill to Parliament. First point, if you go back to the 1940s, in fact, you look at welfare numbers for the past 10 years, DPB figures, Mr. Speaker, have tended to sit around the same figure. We've not seen this dramatic jump or ebbing away. They've tended to sit in the same number for some time. Neither Labour nor National have made dramatic shifts in those figures. For the minister to now claim that actually what she's doing is backing New Zealanders and believing in beneficiaries, and then at the same time saying that all that sole parents are people who go out and breed so they can get money, which is what this clause says. That is what this clause says. For her to claim that and try and pretend that it's about something else, I find completely disingenuous. Secondly, show me, Mr. Speaker, the family who aspires for nothing more for their child than a life on welfare. Show me that family. Show me that mother. Because again, that is what this clause is implying. It implies that that is the only aspiration that a family or a mother has for their child. And that is absolutely wrong. And secondly, Mr. Speaker, show me the woman who has a baby on her own and who is the only one responsible for bringing that child into this world. I might have missed the memo, Mr. Speaker, but at no point have I heard the minister or anyone on that side of the House talk about the responsibility of dads in this equation. And yet every time we're in here discussing sole parents, we're talking about mums in the most derogatory of terms. Well, Mr. Speaker, was there a memo on Immaculate Conception? Because if there was, I missed it. And it's time that we got real. In section 60 GAE, is an absolute denial of reality. It takes more than the denying of access to a benefit to fix what can sometimes be generations of families living at the bottom of the heap. And if this minister thinks that she can fix that issue by simply saying, Mr. Speaker, if this minister thinks she can fix that issue by simply denying access to a parent and therefore a child to social security, then that is the most naive of suggestions. Now, Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we will not deny that there are families who have been at the bottom of the heap for generations, that the issues they face are complex. But to simply say that cutting off their benefit is the answer is not only naive, it's just going to cause us other issues in other areas of our social security system or with our social services. I've seen those issues. I'll take any one of those members out onto the streets with me, with LifeWise or the City Mission, and we can see what happens at the end point of some of these policies. Mr. Speaker, evidence tells us the only way to deal with some of those harder end, the minority, is with intensive case management. And show me how you do that when a work and income case manager has sometimes on their books more than 300 clients. This bill does not address that. This bill is not realistic in addressing some of these genuine issues where they exist, and instead it is making political rhetoric and playing political games with some of these individuals' lives. Let's get real. Mr. Speaker, I want to also speak to the amendments that have been made around medical assessments. When you come to Part 1A of Schedule 2, which I believe is part of this debate, it talks about appeals to the Medical Board. Many of those appeals will be based off the medical assessment process. I would love to tell the House what that entails, but we simply do not know. One of those most important parts of this bill, and we are completely in the dark as to how it will work. In fact, as CCS Disability Action, and I think they said it really well, so I want to share their submission, we support their use of appropriate tests designed to find out what assistance and supports the person needs to obtain employment. However, we have grave concerns about United Kingdom-style assessments, especially when these are carried out by contracted providers. Despite the rhetoric about focusing on people's abilities, these tests have proven to be medical model-based checklists, often administered by people with little real knowledge of disability. Now, why are CCS Disability Action worried about a UK model? Because in 2012, the Minister herself said that that was what she was looking to replicate. Now, we sought clarity at the Select Committee from officials about what was going to be included in these assessments. We got back a short note, which basically says that the bill contains provisions to enable assessments, but does not include how assessments will operate in practice. We asked about the tender process. They said no decisions have been made on what external contractors will be used for these assessments, or whether there will be one or multiple. We simply don't know. Mr. Speaker, Labor has tabled an SOP that says that we shouldn't be passing any changes, policy or regulation-based changes on medical assessments until they come back before this House and are debated. And that is only fair. And any government who denies our ability to do that is a government that has something to hide. And I suspect, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that based on the approach of Dr. David Bratt, who is the Chief Medical Advisor, we have every right to be worried. I saw recently a presentation by Dr. Bratt to people who are undertaking assessments for sickness and invalids disability, and it's called Ready, Steady, Crook. Are we killing our patients with kindness? He openly spreads the notion that access to social security is bad for people's health. Well, actually, do you know what is bad for people's health, Mr. Speaker? An undignified system that doesn't focus on people's strengths and abilities to get back into work. A system that doesn't focus on their wellness. A system that instead allows them to squander in poverty without the means necessary to even ensure that they are one day employable again. That is what is dangerous to people accessing our system, and this bill does nothing to address that. Mr. Speaker, Part 2 of this bill contains in it provisions which, as I've said, seem to take on this notion that we need to be cruel to be kind. Well, Mr. Speaker, we trialled that. It was 1991, Ruth Richardson cut benefits by 25%. Did we see a decrease in access? Well, what we saw was an increase in harm. We went from 30% of kids living in poverty being in the homes of those on beneficiaries to today, closer to more like 70%. Mr. Speaker, this bill will do much more harm than it will do good.
Can I just remind members and to the previous speaker that when we're in committee, the presiding officer is the chairman, not the speaker. That's fine. I wouldn't pull you up on that. I wouldn't pull you up on that matter, but I'm going to call Sue Moroney.